All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Jennifer Lehman with Mission Advancement. It is 9 a.m. in McKinney, Texas, and we are going to kick off our webinar this morning. Welcome, folks who are joining. Do a few housekeeping things, introduce our panel, and get ready for this conversation about capital campaigns. So today I have Angel De Leon over here, who is a vice president with Mission Advancement and a longtime colleague and friend, and Scott Taylor, also a vice president with Mission Advancement, and a longtime practitioner and consultant in our field. So the three of us today are going to be having a conversation about this topic called capital campaigns. But before we get there, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Occasionally, we have some technical issues that come up. My encouragement to you is to close down any other applications. If you're like me, you have 10 or so windows open at all times, and that will slow you down and create some issues. So close down other things. We do have a Q&A box that I'm going to be monitoring. So if you would go to that tab in the Zoom application and begin chatting with us here, we'll test it and make sure it's working, and we'll be utilizing that during the webinar, certainly for questions as we go. So if you will go ahead and type in who you are, where you're joining us from, any kind of shout outs, I'll be monitoring here and get used to watching as we go. I have to say before we get started though, it is the morning after the Texas Rangers won the World Series.
The Rangers.
Awesome.
So I know that will date this webinar forever in our
That's okay.
archives.
It's worth it.
That's what I know. I debated, like, should we do that? But I think so.
Yeah.
Right?
Good call.
I'm not a baseball fan. Gentlemen, any comments about the Rangers?
You're the guy.
Yeah, just awesome. So fun to watch them. 11 away wins. It's a cool story.
It's super cool.
Yeah.
Scott grew up here. I grew up here. Angel, you're a transplant, but you have become like a native.
Yes.
So yeah, living in the Dallas area, never having won the World Series, it's a big deal, even for us non-baseball people. So we're all a little sleepy this morning, perhaps, after watching the game last night. But let's see who we got. We've got Susie from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Paul from Italy. Wow, it is mid-afternoon.
Italy, Texas.
No, Torino, Italy.
Okay, nice.
Exciting. Meg, Legacy Christian. Hey, Meg, good to hear from you. Go Rangers, bravo. Janine from Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. So sorry about your Phillies. And Melissa from Austin. So we've got quite a few. Again, if you're just now joining us, be sure to use that Q&A tab in the Zoom application. We'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to send them anytime. And when we get to that piece, we'll kind of comb through those and try to answer as many as we can. A couple other housekeeping things. We will be sending you the presentation after the webinar today or tomorrow. We also have a couple of tools that we're going to be sending out. So just know that you're going to get follow-up from us. So take notes, send us questions, but you will receive the content later on in your inbox. So with that, I think we're going to get started. Guys ready?
Yeah, ready again.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so capital campaigns. We know a few things about this topic. Do we not? Yeah, we do this a lot. We talk about this every day. Most of our conversations with clients, prospective clients, have something to do with extraordinary funding. So what we want to do for the conversation today is have Scott and Angel share from their experience, their perspective, and kind of our firm's collective wisdom about the very foundational pieces that from our perspective must be true or must be addressed as you launch an extraordinary funding initiative. So we're going to kind of keep it high level, foundational, but also talk about some nuances within each of those pieces. So I'm going to start off with the first and probably most important piece, and that's your story, your case. Sometimes we call it case for support. I like to call it story because it is a story. It should have characters and conflict and resolution and all those exciting things in place. So Scott, talk to us a little bit from your perspective about what must be true in an organization's case or story when they are considering launching a capital initiative?
Sure. So I think probably the genesis of everything is a need, right? The urgent need to achieve something, accomplish something, grow, impact, whatever it is. It all starts with that urgent need. And from there, you begin to build around and put some framework around what that how you're going to address that urgent need and the different pieces that it's going to require, whether it's capital building. Sometimes there are campaigns that are focused on just growth. And so the growth may be hiring a bunch of staff because you're building up for a new program or whatever it may be, but you begin to take that urgent need and just put a framework around it. So I think that's kind of the genesis of where you start with developing your story.
That's right. Angel, what would you add about what must be true about a good story for capital funding?
Well, I think one of the elements of a good story is you want it to connect at the heart level.
Yeah.
And what we know is that all giving is emotional. There's always an emotion that's attached to a person's act of making a gift to an organization. And so getting really good at telling that compelling story. So the assumption is that it matters, or else the organization wouldn't exist. But if that story is compelling, then how do we tell it in a way that really resonates with donors in a way that allows them to take the next step?
Yeah, one of the big things that I think helps, and this is something we use all the time, is going back to your high school literature class or whatever, where you're building the fundamental pieces of a story, the plot, the characters, the conflict, all that setting. It seems a little informal or way too formal to really start to sit down and make a list of those things. But the reality is, if we will do that when it comes to our campaigns and really start to think about the who, what, when, where, why, that really does start to frame out that frame around the part that I was talking about earlier of launching into that urgent need. That's the framework around it, is all of those pieces that go into a compelling story that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is sometimes we talk to clients about the difference in compelling versus urgent. And why both of those are important, right? Because compelling is obviously pretty intuitive, like what is the need, who are you serving, what's the outcome, all those great things. But there's also a sense of urgency that typically is needed in a capital project because donors need to know why now. Like what is the problem you're trying to solve that this campaign or this project is going to resolve for you, and why is now the time? Because sometimes it's compelling, but there's not a real urgency to it, and it's difficult to get donors really on board, especially with very large gifts, when they don't feel that tug of this matters right now. Yeah.
I mean, as a leader, if you were ever to say, we're launching a campaign, but if we don't succeed, we'll be okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the doom.
Yeah.
At that point, because what you've communicated is it's optional.
Right.
And to your point about urgency is there has to be a reason why we're talking at this level of gift at this time with you as an individual. I think those pieces coming together creates that sense of, oh, this is different.
That's a big piece too, that when it comes to campaigns, you're always telling a story for your organization, annual fund, whatever it is. You've got needs throughout the year, but campaign is extraordinary. It's something that is unique in the lifespan of your organization,
right?
And it's usually fundamental to some element of growth. And so being able to create a clear message to people that says, no, this is so important that it's got to be something that you do that's above and beyond what you do for us every year, right, in and out. And putting together the story around that makes it a lot easier to say why they should give that super big gift that we wouldn't normally ask for.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is foundational. You know, this feels obvious, excuse me, but I do think a lot of organizations fail to take the time to really articulate this story well. So that's kind of our point this morning is it may seem obvious to you that you're growing, you need a new building, you need renovations, you know, that may seem very clear, but there's probably a lot of nuance and outcomes and emotion, as you said, Angel, that you can really add to that story that really helps donors understand the why a little bit deeper. So encourage you to ask a lot of questions, get people in a room that aren't a part of the everyday with the school or the organization that you're with, because their questions and perspective are going to challenge you to improve that story. Okay, let's move on. Angel, you alluded to leadership a minute ago, so I'm going to go there next. And leadership in a campaign, from our perspective, kind of has two primary components. So why don't you talk about those two and why they matter?
Sure. Well, we talk a lot about campaigns from the context of what's the continuum of things that have to happen in order for a campaign to succeed. And case is certainly one of those, the story. Leadership is another really critical piece of that. And that involves paid leadership staff. So an executive director, a CEO, president, head of school, or volunteer leadership. And so both of those are important all the time for a nonprofit, but in particular in a campaign, because you're asking people, again, to consider something extraordinary. And they normally will view the campaign through the lens of leadership. So if there's any equivocation on the part of leadership that they're not completely confident in this decision, then that'll be picked up by stakeholders and constituents who are being asked to make gifts.
Yeah.
So that credibility, you know, so if you think about paid staff, typically they are the chief vision caster. They're the one that theoretically ought to be the best at telling the story. But as well, a board would be critical. And I mean, imagine the uncomfortable moment for a president of an organization if he or she is sitting in front of a donor and saying, I'd like to ask you to consider something extraordinary. And that donor asks that leader, tell me how many of your board members have committed to this campaign. He or she has to be able to say 100%, because without that, there's no credibility. And it's hard to ask someone who's not that close to the heart of the organization to consider something that important if the people that are already in the middle of that, the core, aren't there themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of credibility, really, when it comes to a campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it affects the urgent need that we were talking about a few minutes ago. In my work on campaigns, the thing that I've seen stall a campaign out the fastest is a lack of support from the board, because you're trying to get other volunteers excited and engaged about it. You're trying to tell that story, but if they're not in it, I don't know. It's almost, this is weird, but it's almost metaphysical. Like the board, the board members can like not talk about it at all. And it's the absence of talking about it that ends up sending a nonverbal signal to everybody that this doesn't matter.
Right.
You know, it's not as important and compelling as we think it is. And so it can cause things to just come to a screeching halt. And then you end up spending a lot of time trying to rally your board or that volunteer group back around an issue that they seemingly supported initially.
Yeah.
So say a little more about the volunteer leader component in a campaign. So, you know, our model is highly dependent on organization leader as well as some volunteer leadership that really drives campaign activity. So what's the role of volunteer leaders in the campaign itself?
Yeah, so typically in a campaign, we would have what we call a campaign leadership team. And these are individuals who are very carefully selected to serve alongside of the organizational leadership. And their role is twofold, probably more than that, but primarily is, number one, they are, again, giving credibility. When the kinds of people that serve on those committees are the types of people that others look at and say, wow, if they're involved in this at that level, this must matter to this organization. And so that's the effect that those types of people have. But there's also a functional role, because there's a peer-to-peer aspect to that as well, which we will often counsel our clients to really leverage. And so a lot of times they can be an entree relationship-wise into a relationship that the leader may not have that much depth with. And so they become sort of they open the gate, if you would, for that conversation and that relationship to begin. So there are real functional roles that those volunteers play, but they are fundamentally leadership roles. They need to understand we're not here to plan dinners and make, centerpieces for dinners and parties. We're here to lock arms with leadership to help raise the sights of our community as it relates to this opportunity.
Yeah.
I also think they're an accelerator to a degree.
Yeah.
That they do bring introduction and open doors and things like that, but they also already have established connected relationships that are so close that the people listen to them, and that accelerates the other person's willingness to hear more about that campaign.
Yeah.
Where a staff member, it might take 4 to 6 different kind of connection points just to get them to sit down and have a conversation. Right. Whereas this campaign leader can walk in and within one phone call, you're having the conversation.
Yeah.
And that's when you're talking about urgent need, campaign time frame, sometimes you get backed into a corner on construction timing, and that becomes a critical element of moving the needle. Is how fast can you make those relationship connections without it being forced and artificial?
Yeah.
And you can't do that without other people around you helping to make those connections.
And it's one of the reasons why we're so particular when it comes to helping our clients enlist that leadership team.
Yeah.
Because it has to be those kinds of people who are comfortable talking about the scale of those projects, the amount of, the amount of the gifts that will be asked for. They can't flinch when it comes to those kinds of things. And so it's a really unique person that has the experience and the comfort level and understanding of the nature of the task that they've been asked to take.
Yeah.
That feels like sorry, go ahead.
No.
That feels like a big component of it is defining what you need out of a volunteer. It's not just, defining their role. That can be pretty easy, but defining the characteristics of who fits those roles is a different thing altogether. And knowing that you have someone who's comfortable about talking about other individuals in the community and how to connect with them and what their passions and interests are, and frankly, their capacity, right?
Sure.
We've got to talk about capacity at some point. It's what we do. But the other piece of it is that they actually know the community that they're connected with. We see sometimes with organizations we work with, we'll start to have the conversation of, well, who should we have on a campaign leadership team? And they'll throw out some names, and inevitably somebody on that list will ask the question, well, what's their group? Like who's the group that they run in your community? And they'll say, they're kind of loners, they don't really volunteer that much, but they're great people.
Yeah.
They'd be great for this. And that's where it's like, they're great people, but they're not great for this.
Yeah, there's a role for them in some.
And it's not campaign.
The only thing I would add is just, the campaign needs to be elevated out of day-to-day work.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really common mistake that organizations make. And the campaign leadership team intangibly can do that, because this is an extraordinary moment. I mean, couple of years probably in the life of an organization. And I think too many organizations allow it to just become another thing in the day-to-day business. And if you don't elevate it with a group of people who are tasked specifically to move it forward, it will drag. It will drag. And just the accountability, quite frankly, of an organization leader who has to show up to a meeting with a high-level volunteer
Right.
makes them get their stuff done.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Can we just be honest that
that's true.
sometimes, we as CEOs and presidents and leaders of organizations, we just need that motivation of a high-level volunteer who expects me to make my calls and expects me to get those meetings done. And I don't feel that same accountability in my day-to-day work with my staff or even my board.
Mhm.
So I think there's, an elevation that happens when you have this group of people who say, our job is to move the campaign forward. And we'll talk about timeline in a minute, but it just gives it that extra sense of importance and difference in the day-to-day life of the organization.
The other way that accountability partner is really important sometimes is the day-to-day can become a huge distraction from a campaign, right? Tyranny of the urgency or the urgent. When you have a campaign leadership team, and in particular, someone who's leading that effort as a staff member, now you have somebody to go to say, we are getting distracted every day. I need your help in talking with the leadership of our organization to get focused, because sometimes that voice isn't heard the same from a staff member as it is from that volunteer.
Yeah.
And so they can become your accountability partner to the organization's leadership as well. And that can help get things back on track and get that momentum going again.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're going to talk timeline in a minute, but before we do, third foundational piece, we talked about story or case, we talked about leadership, is prospects. And I feel like too many organizations skip the first two and go straight to prospects, right?
The fun part.
That's the fun part, and that's the activity and the execution for sure. But Scott, talk a little bit about kind of the way we evaluate and think about the proper and ideal prospect pool for a campaign.
Yeah. Well, I'll start where my head is and then you guys can fill in. So ideal prospect is someone that knows you, right? What you're looking for is connection and relationship. And, no, not getting into timeline, but campaigns do have a timeline. And so building those relationships and how fast you do that becomes critically important. And so we work with a lot of organizations that say, we just need a bunch of new donors. We don't need new donors. We need to know who the donors are that you already have and where are the relationships with those individuals. And that becomes the starting point for what is the main base of prospects that you need for a campaign. The other piece of that, we just need a lot more donors. A lot of people will think that, well, this is going to be a campaign that involves everybody. It may involve everybody at some point, but to really launch a campaign, you need those individuals within your community, your organization's community, that can have significant impact very early on. And the reality is those prospects, your top 30 to 50 are probably going to do 90 to 95% of the lift for your campaign. And so that's where the relationship piece and starting with those individuals who are already giving to you in a significant and consistent way is the foundation of creating a successful prospect pool for your campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Angel, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think that, and it's so easy to slip into the timeline piece here.
I know.
Timeline must be really good. But no, I agree. Because I think that, it's kind of like, I have a son. When he was in middle school, if he'd come to me and said, "Hey, Dad, I need $5 today," I probably would ask him a question or two, no big deal. But had he come to me and said, "Hey, Dad, I need $500 today," okay, I've got a few questions for you now. What on earth do you need $500 for, right? It's no different with donors. You have a donor that gives you $500 a year to the annual fund or whatever it might be. They just do it. You come to that donor and said, "I'd like you to consider a 7-figure gift for this particular project." It's reasonable to think they have a few questions now. And those questions take time to answer. And it takes time for them to, they may have to make a few phone calls.
Yeah.
They may have to have a few conversations, but allowing them the time to do that in a way that feels good to them and ultimately results in a quality decision.
Yeah.
I think that's the value of really looking at that opportunity to say, and I agree, it's not going to be thousands of people. It's going to be a few people that you already know that you go deeper with.
Yeah. So if you know you're going to need 30 to 50 people, then all of a sudden you have to start to do the math, right?
Mhm.
How am I going to accomplish a campaign with 30 to 50 people? What does that look like? And we refer to that as a financial model.
Mhm.
And you're trying to put together the concept of the pyramid, right? That we've used for so long, but you're trying to create what are all the different gift amounts that you're going to need in order to have success. Because while 30 to 50 may give, somewhere near 95% of your campaign, there's probably 10 that are going to do half that lift, if not a little bit more.
Right.
So now you all of a sudden are starting to think, how am I making sure that the donors that we have in our community have the capacity to help us reach where we're trying to go? And so it becomes another element of making sure that, yeah, we have the people in this community that can help us get there, or maybe help us take step one of what is a larger plan. So who they are, the relationship you have with them, and really understanding, at least to some degree, based on their previous giving and what you know about them, that, yeah, we believe there might be some capacity there with these individuals.
Yeah, and usually I feel like organizations who've never campaigned, which is super common,
Sure.
have this hesitancy or just uncertainty that they have people who can make those gifts. And usually what we kind of uncover in the conversation is they've never had a reason to ask them for gifts like that.
Yeah.
So maybe they've been your event sponsor for the last 3 years, and the largest gift you've ever asked for is 10,000 or 25,000 or something, but there's capacity there to do something extraordinary. There's just never been an opportunity.
Right.
Those are actually your best prospects. And so we could do a whole session on this topic. We're just barely touching on it today, but just high level, we kind of think about the science of this exercise and then the art.
Mhm.
And the science is kind of what Scott was referring to, that 30 to 50 and building a model. And there's some evaluation work to be done to really hone in on the right path. And then the art is what Angel was kind of referring to, more of the questions to be answered and the relationship that needs to be deepened probably before you're ready to ask for the types of gifts that you are probably going to need.
Yeah.
So if you're a science geek, there is some fun math to be done here that really gives you confidence. We call it winning the campaign on paper many times, and building a model that you as a leader say, we can do this. If we approach these people over the next couple of years, here we go to timeline, that we feel high confidence that we can be successful.
Mhm.
So, okay, let's go to timeline. We've been referring to it the whole time. All right, so this is a common myth in campaigns, right? Of how long it takes. And it depends on the kind of organization you are. And there are certain types of campaigns that may be done in a shorter timeline, particularly local churches as a common example. But Angel, talk to us a little bit about how we kind of frame a typical timeline and why we do it that way.
Sure. Well, you're right. Depending on the organization and the type of organization really drives what that timeline looks like. We always talk about campaigns in the context of an 18 to 24 month process. And a lot of times the reaction we get is, oh, wow, that's a long time. But if you think about the things we've been talking about today, those things take time to develop well.
Mhm.
And I think one of the mistakes organizations make, and I think you alluded to it, Scott, a moment ago, was they want to jump right into the fundraising piece. Let's just go ask for money. Why do we have to do all this other stuff? Well, that other stuff is foundational. It's the discipline and the rigor of doing that really well, because it provides you the basis for being able to do the other things well. And so giving, if someone were to ask me, how much time should we allow for this? I'd say as long as you can.
Mhm.
Even before you begin the formal process, give yourself as long a runway as you possibly can to think through, what is it that we want to do? Why is it urgent? Why now? And then begin to put together those pieces, that case, the story. How do we make that in a way that's compelling and urgent? Give ourselves time to enlist the right leaders, train the right leaders. We love it when we get to come in and train a board.
Mhm.
We think that's really valuable to an organization. We get to say things they've been saying, the leader has been saying for years, but when we say it for some magical reason, it all of a sudden is like genius.
Yeah.
It's not really.
No.
We're just saying the same thing. It's just a different voice.
Yeah.
Taking the time to really look through your donor pool and establish who are the people that we know. By the way, campaign is one season in an organization's life. It really makes a case for stewarding well your donors in the long, long journey, because when you get to a campaign, you know them, you have a relationship with them. But those things take time. And so creating a timeline for yourself as an organization that allows you to do these things well without cutting corners, because the temptation is always going to be, let's just cheat the system. And I know, you mentioned we've known each other a long time. Part of that relationship has been, I was a former client of Mission Advancement. And I can't tell you how many times I was tempted to just say, can we skip that step?
Yeah.
Because somebody expects me to raise money, right?
Yeah.
But had we done that, we would have lost.
Yeah.
We would not have had the success that we had. And so that discipline to work the plan and trust counsel, if it's a client of ours, is really something that pays off in the end. It seems like just kind of, okay, it's just, what are we doing? But it really is valuable in the end.
I think there's probably, the way I look at the full spectrum of a campaign is kind of three primary phases. One is, when you're organizing, when you're putting everything together, and there may be a handful of people that are donors or volunteers that are involved in that, but it's a very small group. Then there's what we refer to as a quiet phase. I know silent phase is often used out there, but it's not a secret, or it shouldn't be. So it's not that it's silent. It's just that it's a little quieter than the next phase, which would be public phase. And the thing I see that happens with the impatience is wanting to go into that public phase too fast. And you end up losing some of those really important donors, and they're giving to you in a public phase when what they really needed was a one-on-one conversation to maximize the impact that their gift could have. But now they don't know what that need is from them. And so they're just giving a generalized gift. So I think that there are some things that happen in that organizational phase that can really help ensure the rest of it plays out in a really healthy, successful way.
Yeah. I'm starting to look at questions, so we're gonna move that way, I think next. But yeah, I think, when we talk to boards and leaders about timeline, and there is this tension about that's too long, my question back is, well, are you okay with the consequence of raising a lot less money? Because we can give you example after example after example, even current, of organizations we know that have been in campaign for 4 or 5 years and have not even achieved half of what they're trying to do. And because they're just not following a solid process, a solid approach, figuring out as they go kind of thing. And if it's critical to the organization to hit a certain threshold and not have a lot of debt, and all those things that always happen, it's important that you really map out, is 6 more months or even 12 more months worth it for you to avoid the pitfalls? And there's millions of dollars oftentimes that are at stake. When an organization moves too fast, they raise a little bit of money, they end up taking on an enormous amount of debt that they have to service, and that becomes a whole new problem to solve in the operational budget, right? And had they just taken another 6 months, 12 months, even 18 months, you avoid a whole other host of problems that you're going to have on the back end.
Yeah.
So-
And that's a great point. And the loss isn't necessarily just a financial loss that you leave money on the table, but there's also other collateral damage that comes with that. Sometimes when you shortcut the process, the campaign now takes on a crisis mode.
Yeah.
And everything feels like we've got to do this, and that doesn't feel good to a donor.
Yeah.
It doesn't inspire a donor, it doesn't give a donor confidence. In fact, it just does the opposite. Like, what's happening here? Is there something that I'm not aware of that's causing this, all of a sudden this feeling? And so I think there's things that you compromise when you try to short circuit that process beyond just the fundraising.
One last piece, and then we'll move
Yeah.
to questions.
Yeah.
But I think this is hugely important, especially with capital campaigns. There becomes an urgency to see something start to happen, build something, start moving dirt, whatever it is. And if you start that before you have approached all of those really important donors, those, 30, 50, whatever the number is, if you start that process, it's the same thing, what you were just talking about. What you're communicating to them is a nonverbal signal of, yeah, we just really didn't need you.
Yeah, exactly.
And so their attention begins to turn to somewhere else, because most donors who can give at that capacity, they're giving to multiple organizations. And so if you've sent the signal, we don't need you for this campaign, they'll say, oh, well, great, good for them. I can now focus my giving to this other organization, and you've missed the opportunity.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, so many good questions. Okay, so I gotta decide which ones to pick today. And if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you. So please know that we have them, and we may just email you or reach out individually. But question from Melissa: 100% commitment from the board. We mentioned that earlier. How would you define committed in this case? Scott, why don't you take that?
Yeah. Committed is two pieces. One is, yes, they're willing to vote to approve whatever the campaign is. That's the easy button oftentimes. The committed piece is the financial piece.
Yeah.
If they're not willing to make a gift, then they are not committed, period. And we have had campaigns where we had to stop and meet with the board and say, are you really committed to this? Because you're not giving, and it doesn't look like it. So I think that's what committed means to me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you alluded to this earlier, Angel, but sometimes we describe a constituency as concentric circles, and the board is in the center. So the board and leadership of an organization is the middle of the circles. And then the next group of donors, think of them as the next outer circle, and so on, right? You can imagine your donor base in that way. Everybody outside of the center believes that the center is committed. And why would you ask me to do something that you aren't willing to do?
Right.
I mean, that's the question we often have to ask in a very pointed way, because that's how donors view it. So if the board isn't financially committed themselves, how can they possibly go outside that room and ask others to do that? So that doesn't mean everybody on the board is a 7-figure donor. Boards should be diverse and have diverse capacity, and they should make meaningful, thoughtful gifts in the same way we ask other donors to.
Yeah, and those are true good, meaningful, thoughtful gifts.
Yeah.
It's all relative.
Right.
But yeah, it's an expression. If a board member does not financially support a campaign, they're making a statement of some kind. And it doesn't work to say, hey, we're going to give $1,000 on behalf of them so that we can say that. Just doesn't work. I mean, that's just, you have a lack of credibility.
Yeah, it's definitely not a give or get model, right? It is just purely give. And as you pull the next question, I think the other little piece of that I would tweak in what I originally said is, it's not just the gift, it's the meaningfulness behind the gift. And did they give you $1,000 when they could have given you 100,000? Because that's sending a message.
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, I think Nancy, you just answered your follow-up question, which is, can their commitment be from someone they solicit and not their own pocket? The answer is no. No,
Correct.
from our perspective.
Thank you for soliciting it.
Yeah.
But it's not.
They should be doing both, quite frankly. Yeah. Okay, so let's do one or two more. So Deborah asked, did I miss hearing us talk about feasibility studies? You did not miss it. We did not address feasibility studies in any detail today. I'd love to have a conversation with you offline about whether you need a feasibility or not. I'll just very quickly maybe address that one and say feasibility studies can be really, really good step for many organizations thinking about campaign. Feasibility studies are going to do two big things. Yes, they're going to help you with some confidence about maybe how much you can raise, which is what everybody really wants to know. They're also going to give you a lot of good feedback on your story and your leadership and things like that we talked about, just those foundational pieces that really helps you as an organization determine not just how much you maybe can do, but are you ready? And what are the questions that donors have?
Yep.
I think the case feedback from my perspective is probably the most helpful.
Yes.
Because you really learn what donors want to know, need to know, what needs to be true for this case to be compelling to them. And that can be gold. And it really begins a cultivation process. So if you have time and resources to engage in a feasibility study, which adds another 120 days probably to the process, it can be time very well spent.
Very well,
yes. Yeah. Other thoughts
Absolutely.
on studies?
Yeah, just one, and that is different organizations will do studies in different ways. And sometimes feasibility study truly means financial feasibility, not total feasibility.
Yeah.
And so it's why we use a different phrase for it. We call them planning studies. So what we're looking at is, what is it going to take for you to plan to achieve success? And all these different markers that we've talked about today are the thing that we're studying.
Absolutely.
In that process to figure out, do you have the prospects? Do you have the story? Do you have the leadership? Do you have an urgent need that makes you ready to go? And can you put a plan around it? Right. So.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm getting so many good questions. Yeah. I agree. I'm glad you said that because, nobody can tell you how much you can raise.
Right.
And if somebody tells you they can, run. I mean, we're in the middle of a lot of planning studies right now, right? I mean, I'm in the middle of lots of recommendations and thinking about how we guide organizations. And there's not one case where we can say with 1,000% certainty, you can raise X. We have high confidence that there's a floor, we have high confidence that at a minimum, we think this is a good place to start. But think about the timeline we just described. Sure. Life happens, things change, hopefully for the good, and new prospects bubble up and new information, but also for the bad sometimes. And so a planning study should be way more than just how much do we think we can raise. And I hope that you think about it in the context of all the other components that really, really matter. Okay, so one more. I think we have time for one more. Let's see. Oh, there's so many I want to address here. How do you handle a volunteer leader? This is Erin, who lends their name, but says from the beginning they won't make a donation.
That's an interesting question.
This might stump us, Erin. This is a good one. I picked this on purpose. Scott's squirming.
No, it's not because I don't want to say what I'm really thinking.
I would say give them a different committee to sit on.
That's right. Yeah. And all candor, the campaign is not right for them.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's a nice way to say it.
I was trying to get there. There are a lot of, and also let's start from a position of assuming positive intent, right? There may be a reason that they won't give to your campaign right now that has nothing to do with their love for your organization. So I think circumstance does make a difference as well. But in general, if they're not giving, they're not right for the campaign leadership team.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, so they're asserting value to their name
Right.
and what value that can bring to the campaign. And that, that's a good intention.
Yeah.
But it's not enough.
Yeah.
Not for a capital campaign, not for a nonprofit organization that absolutely needs to be able to say that person is behind this, because that peer, that peer pressure, positive peer pressure is so impactful and so important that you have to be able to say everyone involved at that level is somebody who's financially invested in this vision.
Yeah, I think we overvalue many times the name recognition.
Mhm.
And I think this is a really common direction that organizations go to when they think about who needs to be involved. And regardless of what community you live in, there are names that
Yeah.
always come up that people kind of assume if we can get them on our letterhead or on our whatever, like that's going to really elevate. And I would just tell you practically in our experience, that really doesn't do much to move the needle
Right.
in fundraising. And quite frankly, it might distract if there's a lot of time and intensity put around, utilizing that person in some advisory way or honorary chair way. If they're not willing to give time, that's different. Then there may be an honorary chair type model. But I think the financial commitment from our perspective is the most important.
Mhm.
And regardless of what active role they can play as a volunteer, maybe there is value in somebody making a gift and saying, you can use my name, but I'm not going to be able to serve in an active volunteer capacity. That's probably flipping that question upside down, but the better scenario from our perspective. Yeah. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, I think we have to wrap up. We're getting the signal over here. So thank you for joining us. I hope the conversation was helpful to you in some way. Our construction upstairs has just begun.
Yeah. Right on time.
This is real. This is live. So with that, we're going to wrap up. We will send you the recording and a couple of tools to help you. Please reach out to us. info@Mission Advancement is a great way to reach us, and somebody will get back to you. missionadvancement.com is our website. There's a lot of resources there that are free, other webinars, other tools that we've created that can be helpful to you to talk to your board, talk to other leaders about this thing called the Capital Campaign. So thanks for joining us, and we hope to hear from you soon. Oh yeah,
Shameless
and there's
plug.
a book. Shameless
There's a
plug.
book
Yeah, and we have a book.
on Amazon.
On Amazon.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah, it is a great movie.
All right, have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye
joining.
now.